It's my pleasure to introduce and tell you a little bit about my friend, Dr. Robert Haggard. Robert hails from Eastern North Carolina and received his undergraduate education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he earned a double major in history and English literature. He first came to Charlottesville in 1989 as a history graduate student, and with the exception of 1 year, when he taught out of state, he has lived in Charlottesville ever since. He's a double who, and he holds a master's degree and doctoral degrees in history from the University of Virginia. While still in grad school, he began working on the Papers of Washington, that's George Washington Project, which was at UVA at the time. In 2001, Robert joined the staff of a new project, the Papers of Thomas Jefferson Retirement Series at Monticello, an offshoot of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, which was formerly at Princeton. In his current work at Monticello, he and his colleagues are charged with editing and publishing all of the surviving letters written and received by our third president between the 4th of March, 1809, when Jefferson left public office, and his death on the 4th of July in 1826. To date, 19 of the projected 24 volumes have been published, covering the period 1809 to the middle of 1823. During his stints at the Washington and Jefferson projects, Dr. Haggard has been involved in one way or another in the publication of 31 volumes of correspondence, and he has been the lead editor on 11 of those. This evening, Dr. Haggard will speak to us about Thomas Jefferson's relationship with one of his lesser-known correspondents, General Bernard Peyton of Richmond. Their correspondence spanned 8 years between 1814 and 1826. Again, I'm reading without my reading. Just put these on. Oh, yeah. But yeah, I don't have to squint anymore. For the last two sentences, I will be very clear. Dr. Haggard's comments will acquaint us with General Peyton, whom you may know was a prominent Richmond businessman who owned Farmington towards the end of his life, and he actually died here in 1854. Please extend a warm welcome to my friend, Dr. Robert Haggard.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope expectations weren't raised too high by that introduction. Guess we'll see. Thank you, Sherry, for that kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out and taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to me, hopefully wax eloquent about our third president, Thomas Jefferson, and his friend and business associate, Bernard Peyton. Bernard Peyton, as Sherry, I believe, was just saying, actually owned Farmington late in life and died here in 1854. On the face of it, the two men didn't have all that much in common, Jefferson and Peyton, outside of both being Virginians. Jefferson, as we all know, was a national, even an international figure, whereas Peyton was not. Also, there was an enormous age gap between the two. Jefferson was about 50 years older than Bernard Peyton. When they first met in 1813, Bernard Peyton was a fresh-faced young 21-year-old lieutenant in the United States Army who had been charged with coming to Charlottesville to drum up recruits for the U.S. military during the War of 1812. Jefferson, on the other hand, was already a number of years into his final retirement from politics, having left the presidency 4 years earlier, and he had just turned 70. So what was it that drew these two men together? Well, before I get into that, and maybe it's no surprise, I guess we're going to end early. If the lights start flickering, I'll know to just jump to page 27. And no surprise, before we get into it, since I've worked on Thomas Jefferson's papers for a very long time, I'd like to say a few things about him, and then I'll similarly talk a bit about Bernard Peyton's biography as well. Thomas Jefferson was, as you all know, and is important. A knowledge of his life, his beliefs, even his contradictions are vital if you're to truly understand our system of government, the politics and culture of the early American Republic, and more broadly, in my mind, what it means to be an American. Now, Jefferson was many things over the course of his 83-year lifespan. Native of the Virginia Piedmont, he was born at Shadwell in 1743 in Albemarle County. Student at the College of William and Mary, a plantation owner. At its height, he owned around 10,000 acres here in Virginia, split between a number of properties, the largest by far, of course, being Monticello here nearby, and Poplar Forest down in Bedford County near Lynchburg. And he owned around 200 slaves during his lifetime. He was a lawyer, he was a musician, he played the violin, he was a husband. His wife, Martha, died young in 1782 after 10 years of marriage, shortly after the birth of their sixth child. And this is to say nothing about a purported connection with one of his own slaves, Sally Hemings, who herself bore 6 children in the 1790s and early 1800s. Jefferson was an architect. He designed and helped construct or oversee the construction of his homes at Poplar Forest and in Monticello. The Virginia State Capitol, at least what is now the central part of the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond, the central grounds of the University of Virginia, and many other structures, including a portion of Farmington here for his friend George Divers. Jefferson was a linguist. He read 6 different languages other than his native English. Anglo-Saxon is sometimes known as Old English. You think of Beowulf, back to your school days. French, Greek, Latin, Spanish, and Italian. And he spent a great deal of time, even while he was in public office, in fact, even while he was president, in attempting to find and preserve various Indian dialects. In addition, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, Jefferson coined around 100 words, or at least his is the first recorded use of such words as ottoman, as a piece of furniture, belittle, electioneering, and pedicure. Of course, he was an author. He was the primary author of the Declaration of American Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, around 20,000 letters over the course of his lifetime, and several monographs, including the highly regarded Notes on the State of Virginia. He was a politician. He served in the Virginia legislature, the Continental Congress. He was governor for a portion of the American Revolution and was an American diplomat in Europe during the 1780s, primarily in France, although he traveled fairly widely in Western France, in Germany, and in Italy. He was the nation's first Secretary of State, along with under George Washington, our second vice president, serving with John Adams, and then, of course, third president from 1801 to 1809. Jefferson was also one of the founders of the oldest political party on the planet, and that's the modern-day Democratic Party, not known as the Democratic Party then, however. Last but by no means least, for people who live in and around Charlottesville, he was certainly the driving force between the creation of the University of Virginia. And in doing so, he devoted countless hours to raising money for the school, to arranging for the hiring of faculty, choosing books for the library, designing the campus grounds, and various other tasks. And this is particularly amazing, should be to all of us, that he was doing all this while he was in his 70s and early 80s. Now, such a laundry list is impressive, but what is it that we should know about the inner Jefferson? What was he really like as a person? Well, it's hard to know, but he was tall for his day, soft-spoken, intellectual. He was essentially a vegetarian, believe it or not, and in contrast to his younger brother Randolph, not much of a dog person. I am a dog person, so allow me a minute or two to say a few things about this. We found in the retirement series and published a particularly regrettable letter where Jefferson wrote, and this is a quote, that he would readily join in any plan for exterminating the whole race of dogs. You can understand this because he was a farmer, and he was worried about these packs of wild animals they weren't just domestic pets that we're talking about, that would kill his sheep and his hogs and the like. He saw them as very intelligent and as that being a problem because they were so good at making off with his prized sheep in particular. Jefferson loved books, both as a collector and as an insatiable reader. He valued education and a free press, and in fact viewed both of those as essential to the survival and prosperity of the American Republic. Although a wrist injury, some of you may know the story of how that happened, but I won't go into it, limited his ability to play the violin after the 1780s. Jefferson made sure that his children and later grandchildren played multiple instruments. It was important to him. And he seems to have hummed to himself and occasionally even sung to himself. He was also a maniacal list maker and record keeper, which is why I have so much, and my colleagues have so much to do at Monticello, so that's good. He kept detailed financial records and extensive farm, garden, and weather memorandum books, compiled literary and legal quotations for his own use, cataloged the more than 8,000 books in his personal library, and maintained a summary journal of letters into which he logged pretty much everything he wrote or received from the early 1780s until right before his death in 1826, so for more than 40 years. This journal of letters is of great importance to people like me working on Jefferson's papers. We at Monticello, for instance, have identified around 13,000 documents that were either letters written by Jefferson or sent to him during his 17 years of retirement. By comparing what we have in our collections against what he records in the Summary Journal of Letters, we see that only about 10% of his letters, about 1,500 letters, are missing. We can also see from the Summary Journal of Letters that Jefferson could sometimes be somewhat of a fibber. He would occasionally, but more occasionally than you might imagine, respond to someone's letter by saying that the piece of correspondence that he was responding to had just reached him, and you look and see in his endorsement and in the Summary Journal that he had gotten that letter days or even weeks earlier. So he would blame the mail service sometimes to get himself out of a jam. Jefferson could furthermore be a little snarky sometimes about his contemporaries and political opponents. Jefferson wrote, for instance, that John Adams, his longtime friend, had a, quote, a better heart than head. He referred to his Vice President Aaron Burr as having, quote, much overrated talents, and said that Patrick Henry, who he knew from a very young man, in fact, had, quote, a ravenous avarice, which was his only passion paramount to his love of popularity. In Patrick Henry's case, I think there was some jealousy there. Patrick Henry was such a good public speaker and seemed like the sort of person who could just stand up and start convincing people, whereas Jefferson was very methodical, liked to write things out. They had very, very different temperaments. And I think that's where some of that is coming from. Of course, a lot of negativity came back Jefferson's way during his long career in politics. Alexander Hamilton said of him that he was, quote, an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics. And to be honest, Hamilton had a point about both of those. Jefferson called himself a disciple of Christ, but he was emphatically not a Christian. He believed that Jesus was a great moral teacher from whom much might be learned, but he thought that the Christian church itself was corrupt and a corrupting institution. For Jefferson, Jesus was not the Son of God, the Bible was not the Word of God, and that you could separate the true and the false parts of the Gospels out as easily as, this is a Jefferson quote too, finding diamonds in a dunghill. which tells you something too. This is the Jefferson Bible that you sometimes hear about. As a politician, Jefferson was sometimes a rabid partisan. There was little ill that he would not believe about his political opponents, and he was not above spreading rumors, and in some cases paying others to spread rumors about them. Jefferson was furthermore willing, on occasion at least, to set aside his principles for the sake of expediency. The case of the Louisiana Purchase, the expansion of the United States Army during his presidency, and his agreeing to Virginia's Jefferson Lottery at the end of his life are both examples, are all three examples of this. Jefferson firmly believed in a weak, decentralized government when he was out of office. When he was in power as president, he saw things a little different. All this is just to say, it's very easy for me to stand up here and say all these things, but it's all very human. It's all very familiar to probably most of us. To end all of this on a little more positive note, I have to say that Jefferson was, as you may know, a connoisseur when it came to food and wine. He owned an early macaroni making machine, brought back a recipe for ice cream from Europe, had several of his slaves trained in the art of French cooking, and supported more than 200 years ago at that point stillborn Virginia wine industry. Just 3 weeks prior to his death, which has occurred, as Sherry said, on the 4th of July, 1826, Jefferson received a letter from his agent in Richmond informing him that although his tobacco had not reached Richmond from Bedford County, he would soon receive at Monticello about 10 gallons of wine with an even larger quantity still to come. So who was this Richmond agent writing to Jefferson at the very end of his life? Well, you had to guess that I was going to get around to Bernard Peyton at some point, and that's who that was. So why Richmond? Why did Jefferson have a Richmond agent, and why Bernard Peyton? Now, there's an old adage among historians that the past is a foreign country, and this is particularly true when you think about how people like Jefferson, whose estates were large and produced more than he could use or sell locally, and who had, in addition, a taste for some of the finer things in life, how those sorts of people did business. Nowadays, of course, airplanes and trains and big rig trucks will bring the world to your hometown, wherever it is, and in fact, bring those goods that you want often to your very doorstep. In Jefferson's day, you really had one good option when it came to moving large amounts of goods around. And in fact, if you were going to be moving even small amounts from a distance, and that one good option was to send things by water. So if you did not live on the coast, you had better live on or near a substantial river, and that river had better, at some point, wind up in a port of some significance. Thomas Jefferson, of course, lived close to the Rivanna River, which is fairly small, but which flows down into the James River, much larger, down near Columbia. So the answer to the question, why did Jefferson have a Richmond agent, is twofold. The James River was navigable for larger vessels up to Richmond from the Atlantic coast, and so it was by default a primary market for selling agricultural products like wheat, flour, corn, and tobacco, the very things that Jefferson wanted to sell. It was also the best place for someone like Jefferson to obtain the sorts of specialty items that he wanted. Think books or wine from Europe being examples. Second, and as importantly, Richmond was not just a major port and Virginia's political capital, it was also an important financial center. This is where one or someone like Jefferson could access a credit relatively easily, which was vital to him because however many acres and slaves he owned, he was sometimes, and increasingly actually, more all the time late in life, strapped for cash. So why Bernard Peyton? Well, the first thing to know is that Peyton was only the last of a series of these Richmond agents that Jefferson employed during his lifetime. Just taking the last, say, third of his lifetime, he used the Richmond-based mercantile firm of George Jefferson and Company, starting in 1797. A few years later, in 1804, George Jefferson, who was a cousin of the then president, went into business with a recent immigrant from England, a man named Patrick Gibson, and they became the firm Gibson and Jefferson. President James Monroe appointed George Jefferson as a consul in Lisbon, Portugal in 1811, and at that point, Patrick Gibson took over the day-to-day operations of the business. And in fact, George Jefferson got sick over there and died on the return trip to the United States in 1812. Patrick Gibson continued to play his role as Thomas Jefferson's agent in Richmond until ill health forced him to step back from that position around 1820 and turn it over to a third individual, Bernard Peyton. Jefferson's correspondence with these three men, George Jefferson, Patrick Gibson, and Bernard Peyton, was voluminous. Indeed, Peyton was Jefferson's most frequent correspondent during his retirement. The letters are often short, businesslike, and to the point. Neither side allowed a letter to lie unanswered for very long. And believe it or not, the time it took to get a letter from, say, Monticello to Richmond back then in 1820 is about as long as it takes today. Several days. Almost every letter between the two men contained either important information about their business relations or a question that needed to be answered. And so the letters would fly back and forth, even sometimes several of them in a week. So who was this Bernard Peyton guy? Peyton was born in 1792, seemingly in Stafford County, Virginia, 40 miles or so south of our nation's capital. He entered the United States Army as a first lieutenant just prior to the outbreak of the War of 1812 with Great Britain, was promoted to the rank of captain the following year, and discharged honorably in 1850, a few months after the end of that conflict. By 1816, he had settled in Richmond and set up shop as a commissioned merchant. Early that year, actually in January of that year, Jefferson wrote to Peyton that he was, quote, and this is somewhat long, much pleased to learn that you had set up business at Richmond in the mercantile way, and I sincerely wish you success in it. It will be an easier life than that of the camp, the military camp, and a happier one. My dealings are chiefly, of course, in this place, yet there have been often occasions in which I have wished for some mercantile connection in Richmond, for supplies of things not to be had here, or at prices too unreasonable. Your establishment furnishes me with this accommodation, and certainly I would rather have it with an acquaintance and friend than with a stranger. That's the end of the quote there. Maybe Jefferson's turning to Peyton as a business associate shouldn't be all that surprising. He was somewhat of a known quantity, in fact. Of course, the two men had met in 1813, and Peyton must have made a relatively good impression on him, because a year later, Jefferson invited Peyton to come to dinner at Monticello. This was what he called a, quote, dinner on peas, which you're all familiar with. In addition, Peyton had been an officer in the regiment, the 20th Regiment, that was commanded by Jefferson's own son-in-law and later governor of Virginia, Thomas Mann Randolph. And he also knew Thomas Jefferson Randolph, one of Jefferson's favorite grandsons. So he was a known quantity in several ways. In fact, in 1816, Jefferson expressed, quote, the hope that your business, Peyton's, will permit you occasionally to visit your friends in this neighborhood, and I pray you to make Monticello your headquarters when you come. Not surprisingly, Peyton did come to Monticello on a number of occasions, both by himself and then sometimes with friends and family members in tow. While he was there in the summer of 1819, he was, in fact, involved in helping to put out a fire at Monticello at the blacksmith shop, where he was apparently, according to Jefferson's eldest daughter, Martha, smartly burnt, was the phrase she used. In 1822, he visited the mountaintop accompanied by his wife and by a friend, John Williams Green, a judge on Virginia's Supreme Court of Appeals. Prior to their arrival, Peyton gave Jefferson a heads up about the judge, saying that although he was a man of Roman virtue, fine talents, and character, he was, quote, of a most unsightly appearance. And to emphasize this point even stronger, Peyton actually underlined the word unsightly. I've never seen a picture of this man. I'd be interested to see it. The mention of a wife inspires me to say a couple of things about Peyton and his family. He was married in 1817 to Julia Amanda Green of Culpeper County, with whom he had a large family. And unlike Jefferson and many of his other contemporaries, most of those children actually survived to adulthood. One of them, in fact, was named Thomas Jefferson Peyton and went by Jefferson. He owned a number of slaves, or the Peytons did, while living in Richmond. Fairly small numbers, 5 in 1820 and up to 18 in 1850. And according to the 1850 census, the Peytons owned real estate worth about $13,500 in and around Richmond. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but in today's dollars would be much, many times greater than that. Bernard Peyton was also a director of the Farmers Bank of Richmond on a number of occasions in the 1820s and 1830s. He served as Adjutant General of Virginia from the early 1820s until 1841. He was Richmond's Deputy Postmaster for the first half of the 1840s, a longtime member of the Virginia State Agricultural Society, and a horse breeder. He retired by 1852 to Albemarle County and lived out his last years here at Farmington. As an aside, I should say that I've recently read a dissertation written by one of my colleagues at Monticello where she talks about retirement in the early American Republic. This is a little after that time, but it still applies to someone like Peyton. It was quite common at the time for people who, when it was time for the men of means, basically, when it was time for them to step back from politics or business, to retire to, if they had one, or purchase a country estate. And that's very much what Bernard Peyton did. It was seen as being highly respectable and honorable and Republican, with a small r, thing to do. During his residence at Farmington, he made substantial alterations to the home, remodeling it in the Greek Revival style, adding a small portico to the north side of the building, and in fact, a passage over the service wing to the south. Upon his death, Peyton's remains did not stay here. They were brought back to Richmond by train. His funeral took place at Monumental Church in Richmond, which still stands, you can see it, and he was buried in Shockoe Cemetery. Now, let's bring the two men together, and then we talked a bit about both of them separately. What did Jefferson think about this fellow who was 50 years his junior? Well, in fact, he wrote a number of letters of introduction and recommendation for Bernard Peyton. And this was a little out of the ordinary. Jefferson made it quite clear when he left the presidency that this is not something that he wanted to do. He even went to the point of having printed in 1809 a circular. It's a one-page sheet that was printed, and he had many copies of it made so that he could send it to people. They would write asking him for a recommendation for a government office, and he would send back this circular to office keepers or office seekers, saying essentially, no, I'm not doing this in my retirement. I don't want to use up my capital of friendship with people like James Madison and others in trying to help people get government office. The fact that he was willing to do so for Bernard Peyton tells you something, I think, about their relationship. In 1817, for instance, Jefferson wrote to an overseas friend that, quote, "I recommend Captain Peyton particularly to your esteem as highly worthy of it, and one on whom no degree of confidence will ever be misplaced." He said in a separate letter that same year that Peyton was, quote, "highly worthy of esteem and favor, and a man from whom you will never experience anything but what is correct and honorable." 3 years later, this one's a little longer, in 1820, Jefferson stated, quote, "I take the liberty of presenting to you a friend, Captain Bernard Peyton, a commission merchant in Richmond, proposing a tour of the North. wishes particularly to have the benefit of being made known to you. He has been engaged in his present line for 5 or 6 years, has acted in it with integrity and punctuality, which has procured him the unlimited confidence of all who have employed him. Jefferson informed another correspondent, in fact around the same time, that Peyton, a quote, particular friend of mine, possessed, quote, the affection and confidence of all who know him. So he was laying it on pretty thick. And these were actually pieces of correspondence that were trying to get Peyton more business, essentially. But he also wrote recommendations for public office for Peyton. Between 1819 and 1824, Jefferson, at Peyton's request, tried repeatedly to secure him a federal job as either Richmond's postmaster or as the local customs collector. In an 1824 letter to President James Monroe, the elder statesman commented that he looked on Peyton, quote, almost with the eyes of a father, and that there was, quote, one single case and but one in the whole world into which I would go with my whole heart and soul and should ask as if it were for myself. And that one case would be for his friend Bernard Peyton. As it turned out, another candidate was deemed to be preferable by President Monroe, and this was actually something that irked President Jefferson no end. In a letter of recommendation to the United States Postmaster General a few years earlier, in 1819, Jefferson had described the young man as, quote, one to whom I can refuse nothing, and whose many kindnesses and attentions to me have laid me under great obligations and warmest wishes. So what were these kindnesses and attentions that had obliged Jefferson to speak out so strongly, repeatedly, about Bernard Peyton? In brief, what did Bernard Peyton do for Jefferson as agent? Well, a lot, actually. He purchased a whole bunch of things for Jefferson, a wide range of items, such as books and wine and corks, currency, fish, gypsum used for fertilizer, nail rod to be used to make nails at the Monticello nailery, and many other items. He forwarded letters and goods to Jefferson when they arrived in Richmond. He made payments both to Jefferson and increasingly on Jefferson's behalf to other people. He served at various times as an agent for not just Jefferson, but for members of Jefferson's extended family, the Randolphs in particular, and more generally as an agent for the University of Virginia. For example, when the marble capitals arrived in Richmond from Italy, the capitals that would go on top of the columns at the UVA Rotunda and the pavilions, then Peyton was the man on the scene to make sure those got on the proper boats to take them upstream. He sold Jefferson's flour and tobacco after having it prized or evaluated. He endorsed, renewed, or otherwise managed Jefferson's substantial bank debt in the Virginia capital. The ex-president actually had substantial bank debt late in life with a number of different banks: the Second Bank of the United States, the Richmond Bank of Virginia, and the Farmers Bank of Virginia as well. Peyton did, in fact, even more than that. He essentially served as Jefferson's own private banker during the final 6 years of his life. Jefferson would dispatch his flour and tobacco by boat downstream to Richmond. Upon their sale, Peyton, after taking his commission, would place the proceeds to Jefferson's credit in his ledger. When Jefferson wanted to buy something in Richmond, or increasingly have Peyton pay off one of his debts to those who presented them, then Jefferson would write him an order on Peyton for payment, with the expectation that the Richmond merchant would ante up for him, whatever the condition of the credits and debits in the ledger. Such practices were not uncommon at the time. Merchants often played the role of banker for their most important clients. If the credit and debit columns tallied, or at least promised to do so at some point in the near future, then all's right with the world. The problem is that, you can probably guess this, They kind of never did for Jefferson. The ex-president never, I believe, met a merchant that he wasn't willing to go into debt to. And they, the merchants, were seemingly just as eager to extend him substantial amounts of credit in the overly sanguine expectation that he would at some point be able to make it right. That being the case, and the easy availability of credit had in fact tightened substantially after an economic downturn in 1819, Jefferson came to rely increasingly towards the end of his life on running a balance with a host of merchants far and wide. These balances sometimes got quite large. In 1821, for instance, he owed the Charlottesville merchant James Leach about $7,000. David Higginbotham, a merchant of Milton, if you've been to Morven here locally, owned by the University of Virginia, that was a Higginbotham property late in his life. He owed Higginbotham another $3,000. An April 1823 account indicates a further $1,000 owed to the Lynchburg merchant Archibald Robertson. And these are unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jefferson's indebtedness. So it should come as no real surprise that the ex-president ran up similar debts with his Richmond agent, Bernard Peyton. In July 1825, a year prior to Jefferson's death, he owed the Richmonder just a shade over $1,700. This total ballooned to almost $4,000 by the end of that year. And again, $4,000 doesn't sound like much, but in that day, that was a considerable sum of money. Where did these what were these $4,000 paid for, in fact, or spent on? A little bit of everything. A lot of the debt that Jefferson owed to Bernard Peyton went actually to make payments on older debts to banks, merchants, and others. But there were also a large number of purchases that were made here during that period of late 1825. Jefferson bought, for instance, 4 boxes of tin, 6 cases of marble from New York, and 2 more from Philadelphia, a quarter cask of wine, and 8 gross, or about 1,000 corks. How did merchants carry such large debts? Well, the simple answer is that they oftentimes have real trouble doing so. Peyton wrote to Jefferson at the very end of 1825, pleading with him to pay off the $4,000 that he owed him, saying, quote, if he didn't pay it by January, the following month, quote, it might be fatal to me not to receive it. Now, true, he softened his plea, and this is quite common when people would ask Jefferson for money. They would be very apologetic about it. He would say, in this case, Peyton said, he was very sorry indeed if that raising of money should inconvenience you, and hope it will not. And I hope you will understand that nothing but necessity would induce me to address you on the subject. Jefferson's reply a few days later, in January 1826, informed him, and this has to be read as somewhat fobbing him off, that he had talked to his farm manager, which was his grandson at that point, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, and had told Randolph to do everything in his power to make sure that Peyton did not suffer financially. He said that several times. But the implication was clear. Peyton shouldn't hold his breath about getting that money back anytime soon. His only real hope, Peyton's, was the same as Jefferson's, in fact, in early 1826, was to optimistically hope and expect that the so-called Jefferson lottery that was at that point making its way through the Virginia legislature would allow for the repayment of the ex-president's debts, including Peyton's. Well, it didn't, and as it turned out, and that's partially because of Jefferson's death in July of 1826. And so, like a large number of Jefferson's creditors, Peyton was, to a degree at least, left holding the bag. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention. it's a sad thing when you work on the retirement series that, you know from the beginning when I was hired there that he's gonna die at the end. And so there's gonna be some tragedy involved. So I hate to end with a thud, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have or accept any corrections, because I know there are several members of the Peyton family here tonight. Oh, down below? Okay. Yeah, you need both? Okay. Great.
All right, questions? Walter?
Yeah, you have it.
Okay, I'll ask one. Yeah. Did,
Sharon. Let's get the mic to you first.
did Jefferson ever feel guilty about not paying his debts?
Are we taping this? Yeah, that's right. Well, I don't think so, but I think that the reason for that was probably because I'm somewhat of an optimist myself quite often, particularly about deadlines at work sometimes, which causes problems. But I think that Jefferson was always somewhat of an optimist about his finances. And maybe this is, my father grew up on a farm, and what he would say is that the farmer's mantra was that next year the crops are going to come in, and it's going to rain at the right time, and all's going to be, and the prices are going to be good. And Jefferson, I think, had a little bit of that too. I think that at the end of his life, he was somewhat optimistic that this Jefferson lottery would allow him, even if he had to give up Monticello and Shadwell and many of his possessions, he would actually have money to pay off these debts. And so,
Macabre-like.
I'm sorry?
Macabre-like. Something will turn up.
Yeah, basically. So I think he, in fact, he kept a lot of financial records, but he did not sum up the debits and the credits very often. And he was always somewhat surprised when he did how bad things were. And so maybe that was another reason why he didn't do that. But I suspect that he did not. I think he felt like it was going to work out. I mean, like a lot of people with a lot of land, I'm sure even to the end of his days felt that I'm going to have to sell a lot of stuff. I'm going to have to probably sell some slaves, but it's going to work out.
Sorry for being ignorant, but what was the Jefferson lottery?
Oh, this is something actually at the end of his life that was very important to him. Jefferson, and again, I should say, because I mentioned it as something that he didn't believe in. He talked against lotteries for much of his life, it seems. And then when the rubber hit the road late in life, he decided it was a good idea. It was basically, it had to be actually passed through the Virginia legislature because it was against the law to hold these things other than having a special dispensation. And there were 12,000 or so of these tickets. A few of them still survive. I think UVA has one or more that were sold for $10 each. And there would be eventually, once all the tickets were sold, there would be a drawing, and winners would win various parts of Jefferson's estate, including Monticello and the Shadwell Mills and other things. And so, but the real reason behind it is that since the economic collapse of 1819, it was very, very difficult for people to sell their land at any kind of a good price. So it was really, mainly it was a way for him to know that he was going to get a good price, even if he was having to get rid of various parts of his properties. So that's what that was. It was actually passed through the legislature, but partly because of his death and I believe some mistakes that were made by Thomas Jefferson Randolph, it didn't come to fruition. The tickets were not all sold, certainly.
Hi. Was during his presidency, did this sort of ethical quagmire exist, or was there sort of a Office of Government Ethics that kept him honest, sort of, a la Joe Biden?
Actually, I won't get into current politics, but actually, when Jefferson was president, was one time in his life where he actually had cash on hand because he was paid $20,000 a year, which was a lot of money back then. And so over 8 years, getting that, knowing that was coming in regularly, this is a time when he actually purchased some land in Albemarle County down near Milton, et cetera, using some of those monies. And so even though he had to spend a lot of it in entertaining and various other things, the time when he was in office was a time when he had more cash on hand, which again, people make decisions about their lives and sometimes maybe not the best. It would have probably made more sense for him to, serve a third term, just for the money. Financially, it also would have made a great deal of sense for him to marry again to the George family. But again, getting back to Jefferson's optimism, I think he sort of felt like he didn't have to do those sorts of things. So.
Do you have any idea why Bernard Peyton, besides the notion of when you retire, buying a farm is a good idea, that he bought Farmington?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that he visited here, although I would not be surprised. He, again, had family in the valley, and in fact, even late in his life, one of his last letters to Jefferson, he was saying, I'm coming your way, but I'm not going to have time to stop. So he was back and forth many, many times, but I don't know at this point whether he had visited here or why Farmington.
Yeah.
It certainly was one of the prominent, places here locally.
Question here.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that when Peyton purchased Farmington, he came in and started doing a lot of remodeling and changes and adding additions. Were these the changes that Jefferson was involved in? Did he help him design?
No, this is after that, certainly, and that's long after that. Jefferson's involvement was more in what is now the Jefferson Room itself, and actually it seems like changing over. He did some drawings and you can understand it because it's somewhat octagonal, which was Jefferson's thing. He liked octagons and he liked flat roofs.
Yes. Well, I'll stand. We think we know of a letter that Jefferson wrote to Peyton when Peyton was in Richmond, and the hired professors for the University of Virginia were arriving.
Yeah.
Do you know of that letter?
I don't, but I do know that that's another example of, I know that he helped get those people moving along.
Well, may I share that letter with you?
Sure, absolutely.
Melissa Young, who's on the program committee, found the letter. Will you tell about what the letter said?
Well, the letter was 1824, right after Lafayette's visit.
Yeah.
But first Jefferson says, would you do me a favor? The first professors who've been hired to teach at UVA are coming over. I think they're going to land. Will you make sure they get to Charlottesville? And then then he said, oh, by the way, Lafayette drank up all my wine. So could you send me some wine? But also, the quality of wine does not depend on the cost. Sometimes the very best wine is cheaper or something like that. So that's our favorite letter, the Jefferson letter, because not only does it tie him to UVA, but also wine.
Yeah. Yeah,
Have you seen that letter, Robert?
I have not. It will probably be in our next volume. In fact,
Oh, good.
because I know that the next volume or two will be dealing with Lafayette's visits, and I had seen that there had been some correspondence having to do with the faculty coming.
And in fact, Jeff Looney is speaking next year for Jefferson's, the month before Jefferson's birthday about Lafayette. So he's going to reveal those letters.
Yeah.
And then my next question is, if we want to learn more about Peyton after the death of Jefferson in 1826, where would we look?
Yeah, that's a good question. To my knowledge, there's no biography of him, I believe. So you would be plowing unplowed land, a lot of it, I believe. I don't think he's even in the Dictionary of Virginia biography, or at least they've not gotten that far yet, or whether he's even slated to be in that. Although I would imagine he would be. He was certainly prominent enough for that, being an adjutant general of Virginia, of the Virginia militias for so long. So yeah, it's a topic that's just waiting for its muse, I guess. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well-
Last question, Bill?
Yeah, do we know if, do we know if Bernard Peyton attended the house sale? Do we know if Bernard Peyton attended the house sale at Monticello?
I don't know, but that actually is an interesting question I would like to know now that you raise it. Because certainly that would be something that so many people were actually trying to go and buy things who had connections with Jefferson or obtain things. So, I'll find out and let you know. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's also wonderful to think that we have a portrait of Bernard Peyton in the library with his wife Julia, and I believe we think that they may be the wedding portraits, is that right?
Yeah, so about 1817 or so, Peyton would have been 25 or so years old, and she's several years younger than that.
And so it's wonderful now that when we go into the library, we'll all know a little bit more about that fellow that we
They were
walked in.
very common in that they would do these portraits like wedding portraits today with photographs, but oftentimes they're facing each other, which is what you see right there.
Any other questions?
No, I just want to say in defense of Tom, I just wanted to say a brief comment in defense of Thomas Jefferson, that most brilliant men throughout history have been a little lax in other of the practicalities. But God bless their brilliance to lead us and to be the stars they are, and us peons will pay the bills.
I agree with that, actually. I may have said some things that were maybe a little negative about him's life, but I enjoy working with Jefferson and I've been living with him for 20 years now, and so it's a lot of fun, and I learn things from him all the time. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.